Hello. Today I'm going to talk about, give my little brief review of the stories Philip K. Dick published in 1959. You can find there's four of them. You can find these four stories in the third volume of the collected stories, second variety, and in the fourth volume. Three of them are in here. One is in here. So let's start with this one. Now, thematically, it's hard to join these stories together because they don't really, some actually were written back in 1953. Some were written closer to 1959. They're kind of a thematic mix. So it's not much I can say about them as a whole, except that they are still in this transitional period where a couple things are happening. One is Dick has sort of stopped writing short stories, and so a couple of these were actually things he wrote before and published only later because they finally got published. Some were written at the tail end of his 1950s splurge and writing short fiction. Now, what does he do in the 60s? Well, he publishes two novels in 1960, Vulcan's Hammer and Dr. Futurity, both of which were novels he had written in 1953 and kind of put under the bed in a box somewhere. And so they finally got out. He had actually kind of given up writing science fiction by this point in his career, and he wrote a bunch of what we call like mainstream novels. Some of them were published after he died. One was published during his life, I think, The Confessions of the Crap Artist, but the rest were never published till after he died. And I think there were some manuscripts that were lost, written in that period as well. When he kind of gives up on that, he goes back to science fiction, and then he has this glorious period in the 1960s where he writes something like 15 novels. Many of his best are in that period, and he actually starts with his Hugo-winning novel, The Man in the High Castle. So those are the kind of the two things going on. One is he's sort of stopped writing short fiction, and he's kind of stopped writing science fiction for a while. So it's a bit of an odd mix of stories. The first one I want to talk about is called Fair Game, and this was actually written in 1953, and that's just why it's in this volume, because these are organized based on when they were submitted to the editor, or to the agent, sorry. This is a story about a scientist, a very brilliant scientist, who goes to work, and on his way to work he sees an eye looking down on him, and he starts to ask his colleagues what this could be, and there's different theories put forth, like maybe it's advertising, or some said maybe it's like aliens, and maybe it's, one person says maybe this is what the Greeks thought were gods. They saw these things in the sky and interpreted it as gods. He doesn't quite know what it is, but he starts to think that the world is revolving around him. And it very much reminds us of Regal Gum in Time Out of Joint, because, and of course you can watch my video on Time Out of Joint or listen to my podcast series on that. I'll put the links below for that. But in Time Out of Joint, Regal Gum began to realize that despite his banal and boring and kind of mostly useless life, he starts to see himself as the center of the universe and the center of all attention. And he learns that he is the center of attention for a good reason. In this, it's kind of an opposite of that, where he starts to think, well, why do they want me? Are they Russians? Do they want my scientific knowledge? Is it like kind of spy versus spy stuff? He doesn't quite know. Now, going home one day, he sees like gold, and he thinks about picking it up, but it disappears. And then another time, he's walking home and he sees a beautiful blonde. Eventually, though, he gets caught. The bait failing, the alien creatures just destroy his car using caltrops and tacks, and he's stuck, and then he's netted up. And then he realizes that he's just like a meal. He's going to be cooked. He's thrown into a frying pan. So it's a bit of a joke. It's humorous, but it's not meant to be taken that seriously as a story. But it does have an interesting twist in the end that he thinks he's the center of the surveillance state, and he's not, and he's just food. He's just the plumpest, right? He's not that important in the big scheme of things, and he is kind of an arrogant scientist. Now, maybe I think this is a really interesting look into the surveillance state, because we're all being watched in various ways, if not by government, by corporations that keep track of our data and follow our online habits and all that. But it's not because we're the center of the universe. It's just because they have the capacity to do it, right? And it's, in Dick's point, he's not thinking it quite in that terms, but here he's just a passive victim. But this idea that because the eyes are on us, we assume we're the center of attention, right? That experience we have when you hear someone laughing, and maybe we think, are they laughing at me? There's something wrong with my makeup or my clothes, check, make sure your fly's not open. That kind of experience we sometimes have is sort of what Dick was getting at in this story. So that's all I'm going to say about Fair Game. It's not one of his best. It's one you could probably forget, but it's there. It's a little bit of fun, and the twist at the end is just that he's being fished. And I guess the funniest part is the bait that these aliens try to use to catch him. So next we have Recall Mechanism, also published in 1959. This is a kind of a breakthrough work. I think actually two of the works I want to look at in this video are really breakthrough thematically for Dick. Now, what happens in Recall Mechanism is essentially, I'll be really brief here, but a man goes to a psychiatrist and he's assured that everything is going to be secure and safe, and his secrets will be kept. And he talks to the doctor about his fear, his vertigo, and his fear of heights. And the doctor puts him into a machine that's able to kind of extract his memories and experiences, and they find a true memory of him falling out of a plane, being pushed out of a plane. And the doctor doesn't really tell him this. The doctor just tries to treat him and says, there's not much I can do for you. I'll just treat your symptoms. It turns out that our patient here is a latent, low-grade precog. He can see the future, but the only future he can see is his own death. And, I don't know if you remember, there was an X-Files episode, I think it must have been like the second or third season, where there was a psychic who only could see how people died. It's kind of like that idea. In this case, it's even more banal because you can only see how he will die. And the result of this, of course, is this paranoia over heights. He doesn't know why, but he's constantly terrified that he's going to be pushed off the wind, out of the plane. So he's always afraid of heights. He just wants to be high up. The doctor then proceeds to call the police on him, and despite being assured that there'd be confidentiality agreement with his mental health care, he calls. And I think this is Dick being a little bit paranoid. I'm not sure when he started using mental health services and consuming mental health care, but I imagine when he did that, he was always worried that the therapist was calling the government behind his back. And that's what essentially happens here. But the government doesn't care because his ability is so limited. Now, the context of this geopolitically is it's after a war, and our patient actually works in reclamation, and he kind of divvies up resources to which neighborhoods will be reclaimed from the war first. And the other side of this reclamation is cleaning up the mutants who emerged from the war. And that's why the psychotherapist has to call the government, because his job is partially to keep an eye out for mutants and precogs and dangerous people who have to also be cleaned up. But he's considered so unimportant that it doesn't matter. Now, the story ends with a little bit of a Twilight Zone-y twist ending where a man comes in and he says, I have this compulsion to push people. And it's strongly hinted that he's going to push that original patient out of the plane at the end, at some point in the future. So he's also a bit of a precog. So that's the story. I think it's really important for Dick's career because it looks at the psychotherapist as a threatening, dangerous figure, which is something certainly by the 60s Dick had writes about a lot in the 60s. He really does not like this figure of the psychotherapist for whatever reason. He has a lot to say about therapy and psychotherapy, and I'll talk about that in future videos, what exactly he's saying in regards to this, but he's really touched into some of the 1960s commentary on psychotherapy. And he's very critical here of the psychotherapist because right off the bat it lies. He says your confidence is 100%, and the first thing he does when the patient leaves the room is call the police. The other thing is you have this kind of interesting idea that our mental illnesses are not actually pathological, they're merely, we look at the world in slightly different ways. And this is something he's going to do in Martian Time Slip with a major character there who's autistic, but Dick there presents autism as being not a pathology so much, but as people being kind of out of time and time shifted a little bit. Okay, next we have Explorers We. Explorers We is, it's an okay story. It's not really original for Philip Dick because it's essentially a replay of some themes he explored in a story called Imposter. And basically, we have a crew of men returning from a failed expedition to Mars. Like the ship broke down, but they managed through their hard work to get back to Earth. So they're returning to Earth. They land, and they're so happy to get back to their hometown and see their loved ones. They get out of the ship, and they immediately everyone responds to them weird, and they think, well, maybe because we look dirty, we look like tramps or hobos, but actually they're like dressed oddly, like they don't know how to put on their shoes properly, and their clothing is all misplaced, and that's why people strike them, think they look odd. I don't think we get a full description of what they look like at any point. They go into a diner, and it's completely empty, and then some policemen come and shoot them. And then at the end of the story, we get the policemen basically talking about that this is something like the 20th time that the ship has returned to Earth. And it's always with these imposters, these aliens who apparently are trying to invade. And they're using this crew, the bodies of this crew, or they're making copies of the men on this ship that was lost and using it to try to infiltrate Earth. And they don't really know why. They think maybe the aliens can't tell us apart and think we all look like these 4 astronauts. And so they just think there'll be a convincing disguise, but then they don't really know how to dress and they don't know how to talk. What's really fascinating about this story is the beginning of it, you believe these characters are just returning astronauts. But as the story unfolds and we learn it from outside points of view, that they are really odd and they behave strangely. And they were obvious to everyone that they were aliens. They didn't fool anyone for a second. And so there's kind of an interesting narrative here about subjectivity and how we see ourselves as normal, but other people on the outside may see us as ridiculous and foolish. This is something Dick will take up in a story called War with the Fnools, Fnols or something like that. And in that story, there's an alien invasion where the aliens don't understand height, and they think they send all these small people, and so they're easily identifiable, just as like the little tiny people. But the aliens seem to not understand that size is a factor of how we differentiate each other in our world. A little bit of that is going on here, but I think the heart of it is this idea that's because the astronauts don't know they're aliens. And it's not clear if they're robots or they're replicas or if they're aliens who have been brainwashed and put on like makeup, like in Star Trek, to look like humans. It's not clear what was going on there, but nevertheless, they don't ever see themselves as, they think they're just people returning home. So I don't know if their minds were copied at the moment that the ship was destroyed, but we don't even know the motive of the aliens. We don't know if they're really trying to invade or if they're just trying to get to know them, but maybe they're just trying to return the crew to home and keep being frustrated in that effort. So that's Explorers We. It's kind of fun. It's a nice idea, and Dick's Dizzle seems better in other stories, but it's still worth reading, I think. And then we have War Game. This was also published in 1959, I think in December. So this is another, I think, breakthrough story. Some of the themes that Dick explores in this story come up in the Zap Gun, which is about the relationship between consumer goods and war planning and technologies of war. Now, in Zap Gun, what you have going on is the government creates weapons of war, massive weapons of war, very destructive weapons, but immediately plowshares them, which means turns them into consumer goods because they're never actually used. They're just developed. And, both sides of a kind of a Cold War develop weapons, but they're never actually used because each side keeps one-upping them. So the only thing to do with these weapons is make them into consumer goods. And I think Dick realized the relationship between the military-industrial complex and consumer technologies already by his time, and we certainly know more about that now. So there's that a bit is going on here now, but it's also a really interesting story that looks at like this middle management and this kind of bureaucratic customs agent. Those are our main characters in the story. So essentially what happens is there's a simmering kind of Cold War between Earth and the people on Ganymede, but there's a trading relationship, but the Ganymede colonists aren't trusted. So they're trading, but there's still like this surveillance given to what they're trying to import into Earth. And these people's job is to look at the toys that the Ganymedes try to ship to Earth. And they send 3 toys in this shipment that we know of. And the first is like a cowboy suit that creates like a virtual reality. And now the bureaucrat's job is to look at these technologies, study them to see if they're a threat, and then accept or reject them. So this cowboy suit creates this false reality that's very convincing and realistic. And this one they say we cannot let in because kids will get addicted to this. They'll prefer the fake reality to the real one, and then we'll lose them. So there's this rejection of that technology. The second is like a weird kind of toy soldier game where there's a citadel that's attacked and there's these 12 soldiers, and they kind of play out different tactics where they attack the citadel. And each time they fail, but over time the machine consumes some of the characters, the little army soldier men. And eventually, now they don't know where they go, but they know it's in the machine because the weight stays the same. But over time they lose them, and at the end of its run, finally the attackers win, but they win at the moment when they have lost all their soldiers. Then this thing is reset, so the toy soldiers is returned to the null state, to the beginning of the game. And it's proven not to be a direct threat. They thought maybe it's making a bomb somehow by synthesizing these toy soldiers. It's making itself into a bomb, but they couldn't prove it. The bomb experts didn't know. They eventually just rejected it on spec, saying we don't know if it's a threat, so we're not going to let that in either. Then we have a game called what's it called? Syndrome. The game's called Syndrome, and it looks like Monopoly, and they immediately let it in because they just think it's just another Monopoly game. And then in the final scene, some kids are playing this Monopoly game, but it turns out that the point of the game, you win the game because the inspectors didn't read the rules. The kids who want to play it read the rules, and they see it's not like Monopoly at all. The goal is not to acquire wealth and acquire property. The goal instead is to give away your money as quickly as possible, right? So the idea here is that the plan of the Ganymedean colonists is to teach the young of Earth through this game that they should give up their property and to surrender. So it's like the Ganymedians are playing the long game of ideology. Now, the important core idea of this story is that ideology can be infiltrated into toys themselves, right? So the idea that like the Barbie doll teaches young people to be consumers of cosmetics or fashion, right? But, I don't know if that's true. I think it's actually the other way around, that a capitalist culture convinces people to buy fashionable cosmetics and fashion, and as a result of that, things like Barbie are popular. I'm kind of reminded of the Brown versus Board of Education psychological evidence that was presented, in which they actually used toys to show that segregation created habits of mind among black children that made them think of white toys is better than white dolls is better than black dolls. It's racism that created that. It wasn't the toys that created this race. It was racism that created a certain attitude towards toys, is my point. But nevertheless, I think it's a really fascinating idea that toys can teach habits of mind and culture. In fact, it's very much like a very important story called Mimsy went to Borogovs, I want to say. Maybe someone can remember it. That very famous story about an alien or someone from the future sends back in time some of their toys, and some kids use it and play with the toys, and as a result, they get super smart, right? And they can do all these great things just because the toys they're playing with. The power of toys, I think, is a fascinating idea, and it's been done before in science fiction. But here, Dick is playing with this idea in an interesting way. So there's a lot here. Now, I just want to talk a little bit about Monopoly, maybe. Monopoly, it's presented as a pro-capitalist game, but there's actually a subtext, if you think about Monopoly for a bit, that shows the unsustainability of monopoly and of capitalism, especially capitalism that lends towards monopoly. It's almost got a Marxist undercurrent. I don't know if that was by intention, but it feels like whoever designed it may have been thinking along these lines. You're playing Monopoly, right? And you eliminate players one by one by outcompeting them or whatever, being luckier than they are. And as a result, people are knocked out, right? Now, you win when everyone else is knocked out and you own all the property, or all the properties that are owned by you or mortgaged. What's the next step? What happens after that? There's no consumers to stay in your stupid hotels and houses and your properties. So how long can you last? It's just the only rich guy with everything. So I'm not sure Monopoly teaches pro-capitalist values if you really sit down and think about it. But anyways, the way Dick does it is just a very simplistic way that Monopoly is pro-capitalist, pro-competitiveness, and this other game, Syndrome, teaches just to give up. But that gets through, and the implication is that in the future, young people playing this game will give up and eventually surrender to Ganymede, maybe 100 years in the future. So those are the 4 stories Dick published in 1959, his final publications of the 1950s. A very prolific decade. I was adding up the stories. It's over 90 stories and novels Dick published in the 1990s, which is more than half of the total number of all his publications. Of course, in the 60s, he's going to publish a lot of significant short stories and novels. So bulk-wise, maybe he publishes more in the 60s, but in terms of titles, he published a lot more in the 50s than in the rest of his life combined. So so that does it with those 4 stories, the stories Dick published in 1959. So I'll be back with other videos reviewing some of Philip Dick's work. I'll probably look at Dr. Futurity and Vulcan's Hammer in upcoming videos. So thanks for watching. If you have any own comments about these stories or any thoughts or questions, please leave them below. Please subscribe and you can see my other content. I'm working on some other series as well. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.